Good evening and welcome. I am Janet Ward of the League of Women Voters of New Hampshire. The League is committed to supporting public schools because we recognize that public schools serve as the foundation of our democracy. We also recognize that New Hampshire's public schools are being steadily undermined by recent legislation and policies. We chose tonight's topic, Protecting New Hampshire Public Schools, a post-election update, because in order to act effectively, we first need to clearly understand where things stand now. Fortunately, we have two deeply informed presenters who will share essential information. I'm sorry, one moment. There it goes. Who will share essential information with us. MICHAEL Turmelle of the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation and CHRISTINA Pretorius, Policy Director of Reaching Higher New Hampshire. MICHAEL will begin.
Thank you, Janet. I'm going to start by trying to share my screen here, and please tell me when you can see.
Looks good.
You can see the slide deck.
Yes,
Perfect.
indeed.
So first and foremost, thank you for that warm welcome, Janet. It's a pleasure to be with the League of Women Voters and all of your guests this evening. I am the Director of Education and Career Initiatives at the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. And then for folks out there who are watching this presentation, Janet had asked me to sort of accomplish two missions here with my conversation this evening. The first sort of goal was to explain how the Charitable Foundation came to this issue of education equity as being one of our primary goals to try to elevate in terms of areas where we want to see progress in our state. And I'm going to try to trace back some of those roots for folks to understand how we got to where we are today. And then the other piece that Janet asked me to do was to share our current thinking, what our policy priorities are going into this sort of next legislative session and the areas that we are concerned and would like to elevate for folks. So without further ado, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Charitable Foundation to give people a little bit of background. New Hampshire Charitable Foundation is a community foundation. And unlike most community foundations, which are narrowly focused on one small geographic area like a city or a region, the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation is a statewide community foundation, which means that we focus on issues all across the gamut. Any issue that would impact the quality of life for New Hampshire folks is something that we're interested in. And we are involved with issues and supporting nonprofit organizations and working with donors all across the state, from the southern tip of our state in the Seacoast region all the way up to the North Country. In fact, we cross over a little bit into Upper Vermont and to some southern parts of Quebec. And we also extend a little bit further east into southern Maine with some of our programs and projects as well. The Charitable Foundation, I was reminded recently that this issue of education equity really is baked into the foundation of our organization. And to illustrate that, our foundation was created back in 1962, and some of our first funds that were created were actually scholarship funds that were created to try to address equitable access to higher education, particularly for students with financial need. So we trace this issue of education equity right back to our founding in 1962. I want to talk a little bit about two bodies of work that have led us to this point where we are today. The first piece I want to talk about is, and my slide is not advancing. Let me try to. The first thing I would like to do is talk a little bit about our strategic plan, which, we have just in January of last year come out of about an 18-month-long process of looking at the way that our organization operates within the state, the way that we create partnerships, the way that we reach into community, the types of programs that we try to invest in, the way that we invest our own funds to try to make sure that we can provide for a just and equitable future for New Hampshire folks into perpetuity. we looked at every aspect of our organization to try to see, to really chart a course for the next 10 years or so. And through that, year and a half long process, we have come out on the other end of that, much more in touch with community and what the needs are of people with lived experience in New Hampshire. And really we've come out laser focused on the issues of equity and racial justice. And if you look at our strategic plan, and I will share a link with you a little later on our strategic plan, the issues of equity and racial justice are front and center. On your screen, you can see that in general terms, our purpose is to make New Hampshire more just, sustainable, and vibrant community where everyone can thrive. And that phrase, where everyone can thrive, is really central to the conversation that we're going to have today. What you see in New Hampshire is what some folks refer to as the New Hampshire paradox, where if you look at New Hampshire as a state, we're very highly educated, but not everybody. And there are huge gaps in who has high degrees of education. We're a fairly wealthy state, but we have deep pockets of poverty. We have a really strong education system, but not all kids have access to the same levels of high quality programming. So that's the paradox of New Hampshire. If you look at it from the outside, we look like we're relatively affluent, well educated, have high incomes, but if you dig just a little bit below the surface, we have this huge opportunity gap. And I'm going to talk about what that issue is, opportunity gap, in all aspects of life in New Hampshire. And we're going to focus today on the opportunity gap in the education world. You can see that as far as our work is concerned, we really achieve our purpose through 6 different functions. And supporting nonprofit organizations is probably the one that most people are familiar with. We grant to 501c3 organizations that work on these issues to elevate quality of life in New Hampshire. And as I mentioned earlier, the issues range across the broad spectrum of everything you could imagine, from the environment to education, substance use disorders, housing, homelessness, access to food insecurity. If it impacts quality of life in New Hampshire, the Charitable Foundation is invested with our nonprofit partners to try to address those situations. When you look at our values, the last 2, equity and justice, as I mentioned, are really front and center in our new strategic plan. But we also believe that some of the components that have kept people away from access to opportunity in New Hampshire has been marginalization and a lack of a feeling of belonging in the community. When we did our strategic plan over those 18 months, we were involved in a really interesting project we referred to as the community listening team. And we had folks from all walks of life, people that have faced virtually every challenge you can imagine, from homelessness to substance use disorder, and folks who are previously incarcerated. And we talked with all of these folks that had been marginalized, and we asked them about their life experiences. It was a really eye-opening experience. And one of the most interesting features was that large group of people that we connected with said, we don't want to speak for all people in New Hampshire. We would love to go out and do interviews. And they conducted over 500 interviews in their home communities spread out all across New Hampshire. And those interviews gave us a window into the life of people in New Hampshire and the challenges that they face. And one of the largest challenges that they elevated was a sense of a lack of belonging, that they felt that they weren't part of their community if they were in one of these marginalized situations. When I mentioned the strategic plan, it really has 3 components to it. But the bottom 2 components on the pyramid that you're seeing, mobilizing philanthropic resources and aligning our operations, really are in service to that upper idea. And that upper idea is that we want our working community to be front and center. And there are 2 components of that we want to get much better at. I highlighted one of them, and that is getting closer to community and better understanding the needs of community. And we are embarking on a whole wide variety of different types of partnerships with people with lived experience to help guide our work. And in some cases, that may actually mean ceding authority for things like grant making to these people. We believe that there are occasions when they know best what's needed in their community, and we're talking seriously about changing the way that we interact with nonprofit organizations, because we don't always, as a large organization, we don't always know the best solutions. So elevating community voices is one key component of leading with our work in community, but the other part is an increased focus on equity and racial justice. And you will see themes of those throughout our entire strategic plan. And I will drop, as soon as I'm done speaking, I'm going to drop two links into the chat box. I'm going to drop a link to our strategic plan so that you can see the detail level of how the Charitable Foundation wants to address these issues of racial justice and equity. One of the things that I can just sort of foretell for you is that this issue of education equity is deeply embedded in our strategic plan. So you will see over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, a large commitment on the part of the Charitable Foundation, its human resources, staff working on these issues, focused like a laser on education and education equity issues. We believe strongly that education equity is one of the most serious equity challenges facing our state. Christina is going to share a lot of information with you tonight, but one data point that I would just like to share with you is that roughly 77 to 79%, and it varies a little bit year by year, that's why I'm giving you a range, between 77 and 79% of our school-aged children, about 167,000 of them, 77 to 79% of them reside in the community with below average property tax valuation, which means that those districts have to set inequitably high tax rates just to raise a little bit of money for their schools, while other property rich communities can set very low tax rates and raise a boatload of money for their schools. So that's why we have this, at least one of the reasons why we have such an equity gap in our state is if you go from community to community, you will see the differences are quite stark in terms of what kids have access to. If they happen to reside in a zip code with very high property values, the ability to raise a lot of money for their schools, they may have access at the high school level, for example, for 15 or 16 or 17 advanced placement courses. And you might be able to go to the town next door, which has low property values and is really struggling to meet the needs of their schools. And there may not be any advanced placement courses in their high school. So the students going to those respective schools face very, very different outcomes. And that issue of education equity is deeply embedded in our new strategic plan, and I will share that link with you. I happen to work with a team of folks at the Charitable Foundation that are focused on an initiative that we refer to as New Hampshire Tomorrow. And this New Hampshire Tomorrow initiative really stems back to the early 2000s, even though the New Hampshire Tomorrow program was not launched until 2016. If you look at some of the data from the early 2000s, you will start to see some troubling data around the youth in New Hampshire. That's where we started to see, for example, that even though in general terms, we had fewer students in poverty was one of our highest growing demographic areas. So more and more kids were falling into poverty. We saw vast differences in the education system, community by community. We saw vastly different outcomes in health, community by community. And a lot of this is based on what we refer to as the opportunity gap. And the second link that I'm going to drop in the chat is really a book that I would recommend that anybody that has an interest in these issues takes a look at. And I'll drop the link to this. The name of the book is Our Kids, and it's by a sociologist, Robert Putnam, who happens to live in New Hampshire, but is a Harvard sociologist. And he looks at all of the variables that lead to a successful life And then he goes back after identifying those variables. He looks at what the challenges are facing our kids in America today. And what he has found in his study, and it's beautifully illustrated in lots of stories, which is what makes the book so compelling. He illustrates that for the first time, our kids in this generation are on target to not do better than their parents, which is something that we have been able to count on since the end of World War II. Every succeeding generation has done better than the previous generation in terms of quality of life, life expectancy, earned income, attainment of education. And for the first time, we're starting to see, and Putnam illustrates in his book, what he refers to as the youth opportunity gap. And we see that youth opportunity gap here in New Hampshire. And so following on, all of the work that research was done in New Hampshire in the early 2000s, with Putnam's book illustrating this issue, the Charitable Foundation back in 2014 started discussing this youth opportunity gap and really realized that if we wanted to influence the quality of life in New Hampshire, we really had to focus on children. And so from that, in 2016, the Charitable Foundation launched the New Hampshire Tomorrow Initiative, which in general terms is a cradle to career youth opportunity initiative, which basically says that the quality of life that young children have is directly connected to the success of people in their 20s and 30s, that we can actually trace back sort of life outcomes based on the experiences people had in their youth. And so the Charitable Foundation has really focused on this youth opportunity gap, and we have folks working on virtually every issue area that you can imagine that would impact children. So we have folks that are focused on early childhood, not just early childhood education, but access to high quality early childhood child care, for example. Looking at making sure that very young children have access to good nutrition, have access to early screenings to make sure that they are on track to have success when they go into school. We have folks who are focused on helping students or young infants that are born into addictive households. So we have folks that are focused on the early aspects of life. We have folks that are focused on family and youth support, so that age group, between 5 and sort of adolescence. We have folks who are working on the issues that impact families, like substance use disorders. And I'm focused on, and I work with a team of folks that is focused on education and education opportunity. So that's sort of the background of how the Charitable Foundation has come to this issue of education equity. It, as I said, is baked into our DNA from the very first founding back in 1962. But really, over the course of the last 15 years or so, we have learned a whole lot more about this youth opportunity gap and what it's going to take to secure a high quality way of life for our young people. And it's really by investing in them early on, cradle to career. So here we are now in 2022. We know that the foundation has identified this issue of education equity as a key driver as we look at our strategic plan. So what does that mean in terms of the things that we're focused on and the things that we're trying to work on? I really kind of boiled it down to these bullets here. And I guess in a nutshell, I would say that this work that you see on the screen really kind of falls into 3 buckets of work. The first big bucket is a long-term project, right? This issue of inequitable school funding. Basically, the issue is that our state relies incredibly heavily on local property taxes to fund our public schools. Decade after decade, of Supreme Court rulings have determined that our system is unconstitutional. And it's unconstitutional based on two very specific pieces. The issue is our Constitution talks about adequate education, the state's responsibility. The state's responsibility is to deliver an adequate education. It doesn't say the local community, it's the state's responsibility to deliver an adequate education. And right now in our state, the base funding for a student is $3,700. And when you add a little bit in, if a student is on an IEP, and you add maybe a little bit more on if they are on free and reduced price lunch, and, which is sort of a proxy that we use in New Hampshire for poverty. And if you add maybe a little bit more on if the student is not reading at grade level at the end of grade 3, when you add those things in, the average sort of grant is about $4,500 per student. The reality is that it costs right now about $18,000 per student. So there have been lots of challenges that have said that the education that the state thinks it's providing with that $3,700 base, which accumulates to about $4,500 on average per pupil, doesn't even come close to addressing what an adequate education is. That's the first component of sort of the unconstitutionality. The second component is the Supreme Court of New Hampshire has ruled that it is the state's responsibility, and the state must pay for that with a uniform and proportional tax. That would mean that everybody would pay the same. If property tax was going to be used, for example, that everybody in the state, regardless of where you live, regardless of, you know, whether you lived by the ocean or you lived, you know, up in the North Country, everybody would pay the same uniform tax. That is not how things work in New Hampshire. So after decades of this work, we know that a solution to that problem is going to be a long-term solution. It's going to take legislation. And so the first big bucket of work that Charitable Foundation is interested in is this long-term issue of solving the inequitable way that our schools are funded in New Hampshire. You'll see that embedded in these policy priorities, which I'll talk with you about in a moment. The second sort of bucket of work is, while that long-term problem is out there and not being addressed, the public school system in New Hampshire is under attack from a variety of different means. And Christina, I believe, is probably going to touch upon some of this, but there is a real national effort that has taken root in New Hampshire to dismantle our public school system. And it's sort of a nefarious plan, and there is a plan. And Christina, I think, is going to talk about some of the ways that this work is taking hold in New Hampshire. But whether it is ban divisive concepts, limiting the types of things that teachers can discuss in their classrooms, or it's book ban challenges that are happening all across our state at the moment, or it's money bleeding out of the public school system in a voucher scheme going to pay for private and religious education and homeschooling for students who were never enrolled. And you're going to hear the vast preponderance of students that are receiving these vouchers never were enrolled or have not recently been enrolled in public schools. And over the course of the last year and going into next year, it's going to be somewhere, the estimate is somewhere around $21 million that will have been drained out of the public school system and steered toward these vouchers for for private, religious, and homeschool vouchers. So the system itself is under attack, and we can't just stand by and let that happen, because a strong and vibrant public school system is vital and central to our way of life here in New Hampshire, and it's vital and central to our democracy. And so we're focused on, in that second bucket of work, really addressing these short-term threats and sort of pushing back and fighting back against them and standing up for parents and for kids who deserve a full, rich, complete, honest, and truthful education. So that's the second bucket of work. And then the third bucket of work is really just elevating what I just mentioned, the important role that public education plays in our state and how it is intricately interwoven with the success of businesses in our state. It's linked to positive health outcomes for young people growing into adulthood. We have a job to do to make sure that every citizen in New Hampshire understands the important role that public education plays, so that when our system comes under threat or under attack, it really is the citizens of New Hampshire who are joining forces with nonprofits and other groups to push back and say, no, we respect, we honor, and we cherish our public schools. Our public schools in most communities are the heart of that community. And sometimes it takes a threat for a local community to rise up, like happened in Croydon, when there was an effort to sort of dismantle their system by removing half of the school district's funding, right? It was the local population, the citizens of Croydon, who stood up and said, no, we cherish and we value our public schools, and we're going to fight for them. So the public policy priorities that the Charitable Foundation is keeping an eye on in this sort of next legislative cycle, and actually going on into the future, is those are embedded in those three buckets of work. I'm going to stop there. I think I've used my allotment of time, and I would love to introduce my esteemed colleague, who is the policy director at Reaching Higher New Hampshire, really the premier public policy house in New Hampshire that focuses like a laser on education. They are a go-to resource in the state for all policy issues related to education in New Hampshire. And I'd love to introduce to you CHRISTINA Pretorius.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you to Janet for having Reaching Higher here. Thank you for that introduction, was amazing. Thank you so much. And, you know, as Michael had said, you know, there's a lot to cover. We just had an election, and now we're looking towards ahead to 2023. So I am just going to take a moment to share my screen. And
CHRISTINA, I'm not able to, I can't close up my screen. Can you unshare mine and share yours at the same time?
I think I can unshare yours. I think we should be good to go.
Thank you.
Is that good? Can you see my screen? Awesome. Cool. So thank you so much for being here tonight. This session will be recorded, so we'll share that. But thank you to Michael, thank you to Janet for hosting this amazing event. And the registration was really high, so I think it really shows that there's a lot of energy behind this issue, which we always, you know, love to see. So just going to quickly dive in with the time that we have remaining. So Reaching Higher New Hampshire was formed in 2015 to support and strengthen public education in New Hampshire. That's taken a variety of forms really over the past 7 years. Our work is focused on informing and engaging the public, lawmakers, educators and school leaders, families and youth, community level organizations, and the public at large on critical issues around learning in public schools, and really uplifting public education as a critical public good, as Michael had said. We center our work around students, families, and communities, and we recognize the importance of a strong, inclusive, and equitable public education for our youth, our democracy, and our shared future. We also believe that a strong public education is really foundational to our democracy and to our future as a state and as a nation. So tonight we're going to talk about a couple of hot topics in education right now. And before we really dive in, I would like to say that New Hampshire really has transformed from a national model for student-centered learning and teaching through innovative student assessment models to really a testing ground for privatization and policies that work to undermine and dismantle our public schools. I think Michael did a really great overview of that national efforts to privatize, defund, and dismantle schools, criminalize teaching about history and other topics, and really demonizing certain students and teachers has really taken root in New Hampshire. We'll talk about some of these efforts and the effect that they've had on our students and our schools, particularly around school funding, privatization, and unbundling, which is a fairly new term, which we've been talking a lot about within the past couple of weeks. It has some really important consequences. So it's something that we are following really, really closely. But first, let's dive in to student enrollment. So these numbers are hot off the presses. Please forgive this pretty basic, clearly Google Sheets graph here. These numbers came out yesterday at around 4 p.m. And so we haven't had a lot of time to really jazz up the figures, but these were just published by the New Hampshire Department of Education. And we see here that student enrollment has been declining about 1% a year since its peak in the early 2000s. So even before this graph, there's been a steady decline in the number of students enrolled in schools in New Hampshire. Today, New Hampshire public schools enroll about 153,000 K through 12 students. This does exclude charter schools. You'll see a sharp dip here in 2020, and that was really the start of the pandemic, when we saw a larger than normal drop in student enrollment. And then there's been a slight dip since then as well. There are a number of reasons for this steady drop. Demographers really point to our aging state, and there are just fewer youth in New Hampshire. According to the census, the number of people under the age of 18 in New Hampshire has declined by 22,000 between 2000 and 2010, and then another 30,000 between 2010 and 2019. So that's been a pretty substantial decrease over that 20-year period. And I'd be remiss if I didn't give a hat tip to my friends at the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute for that great statistic. They are a go-to for anything demographic related. So if you have any questions, that's great. So, the number of students is declining. It's a steady decrease, but their needs are increasing. So since 2013, the proportion of students who are navigating poverty, which is measured by their participation in free or reduced price lunch, school meals, enrollment in those programs, that number, the proportion of students has increased by 35% since 2013. The proportion of students receiving special education services has increased by 25% since 2013, and the proportion of students receiving English language learner services has increased by about half since 2013. And you might be asking, why are we measuring this? Why these specific 3 buckets? And it's because these are the 3 primary buckets that the state has to really target state funding. They allocate additional state funding for students who qualify and participate in free and reduced lunch programs, who receive special education services, and who enroll in English language learner services. One thing that I do want to clarify while we're on this slide, and it's a question that I get pretty often, especially for the free and reduced price lunch, that school meals category. That additional funding, that state funding, it's not to pay for the meals. It's not literally for school meals. That funding is really because the state recognizes that students navigating poverty have additional barriers to learning that require more resources. And participation in free and reduced lunch programs and those counts are the best measure that we have in New Hampshire. So that's why we look at that number in particular, and the other ones as well. So this graph here, we're diving right on into school funding. This graph here shows the change in state funding for state funding for students who qualify for school meals. You'll notice that it is declining pretty significantly since 2022. This differentiated aid category is really, really important because it's one of the primary ways, like I said, that the state allocates resources to high need communities. Those communities who have fewer resources to support their public schools, to support their students, and may have more students facing more barriers to learning. So higher need districts, this is one of the primary ways that the state allocates additional funding to those districts. So they're very, very important when we talk about school funding. and when we talk about community need. So really looking at the graph a little bit closer in FY 2024, which is that bar most to the right, the state will fund about $73 million in this bucket, and that's for about 37,000 students. And that's a pretty substantial drop from 2023 and even 2022. It's important to note here that those 2 years, 2022 and 2023, the state used a relatively different calculation for allocating those funds. So those 2 years, the federal government had a waiver for free or reduced price lunch. So students didn't have to submit that paperwork every year that said, hey, I want my child to participate in a free or reduced lunch. That lunch program was open to all students, regardless of eligibility, regardless of need. And so we heard that schools had a really difficult time collecting that paperwork to be able to submit those counts to the Department of Education. So what lawmakers did was they had sort of this hold harmless provision where districts could either use 1 year, they used whatever count was highest pre-pandemic to that year, which was 2022. In 2023, they had a bit of a different calculation, but they tried to adjust for that, for that discrepancy, knowing full well that there may be fewer students who are submitting that free reduced lunch paperwork, but the need is still there. So in 2022 and 2023, there was that those hold harmless provisions, and those ended. Those will end in 2024, which is why there's that steep decrease. And something else that we really want to emphasize here is that, yes, this is fewer dollars. There are fewer students who are projected to participate in free and reduced lunch, but the need is still there. We talk to economists, we talk to experts all over the state, and they remain to, some districts are having some real trouble having students participate, fill in that paperwork. But they say, the need is still there. Our communities still need it. Our students still need it. And it's interesting because it's starting some conversations at the state level around measuring student and community need. Is free and reduced lunch participation really the best metric for community need? Is it the best way to allocate our resources? So we're starting to have those conversations. Other states that have universal school meals are starting to try to figure out how to work that and how to figure out that. And we're really, as a state, just beginning those conversations. There have been a couple of committee meetings of lawmakers and the such in the past year or so. So we're keeping an eye on that, and it is something that we're talking about. How can we better resource our schools and allocate funding in ways that where communities need it the most? So in looking at state adequate education aid more broadly, so this is all of the buckets combined, we see a pretty substantial drop from 2023 to 2024. And I will say, this 2024 number, it did just come out. This was yesterday, 4 p.m. So again, it's a pretty elementary graph here. So forgive me for that. Didn't get a lot of chance to jazz it up. We've been really diving into the numbers, but a few big takeaways is that state adequate education aid will drop quite a bit between 2023 and 2024. One thing that I do want to mention is that these figures exclude the statewide education property tax. This is only funds that come from the state coffers. So in 2023, which is technically this school year, the state will pay districts $707 million. Next year, that's just under $600 million. That big jump is largely due, $100 million of that is largely because of that statewide education property tax cut that lawmakers passed as part of the statewide budget last year. But also there's about $8.6 million drop in funding, largely because of those free reduced lunch calculation numbers. So that's sort of what's happening so far. And it's really important to note that we're reaching a tipping point. The way that New Hampshire funds public schools has been the focus of a lot of controversy, really for decades now. As Michael had said, over and over again, Supreme Court has ruled that the state has an obligation to fund public schools, and so this has been a perennial issue. Every student in New Hampshire deserves a high-quality public education in an environment that allows them to grow, to learn, and to thrive. But we know that students have vastly different experiences and vastly different opportunities because of a system that downshifts most of the cost of education onto communities. And we know that there are a lot of differences in communities, between communities, in how much they can afford to raise, what their resource capacity is for raising money for their schools. There are 2 school funding lawsuits in the works right now that we're watching pretty closely. And we also expect some legislation to be proposed in 2023. So this is an issue that, it will continue, and we will continue to be engaged there. And sorry if I'm going a little fast, we got a lot to cover. So, I'm going to take this opportunity to shift gears a little bit and talk about some other big topics in education in New Hampshire right now, starting with school vouchers. So New Hampshire lawmakers passed really one of the most expansive school budget programs in the nation, the school voucher programs in the nation, as part of the state budget in 2021. And this year, it will enroll over 3,000 students. Parents receive an average of $4,800 per student, and they can use that money to pay for private school tuition, to pay for books, curriculum, other education expenses, tutoring, materials, all of those kinds of things. This year's school vouchers will cost taxpayers $14.7 million, with about 77% of that money going to parents whose children were already enrolled in private schools or were already homeschooled before the program was even passed. So the vast majority of these public funds are going to families who were already outside of the public education system. There's also very little accountability with these funds since they're managed by an independent third-party company. We've had to rely on, honestly, pretty intermittent reports to a legislative committee, and that committee hasn't met since March of 2022. So there's not a lot of accountability or transparency with how these funds are being spent, these public funds, where the money is going. And there's also been a lot of concern over whether these funds are really making an impact. The public doesn't receive assessment data or other information. So it's really hard to track student outcomes and to tell, with public schools, with charter schools, you can download assessment data, you can see trends, you can see how students are doing. This, you can't really see how students are doing who receive school vouchers. So there's not a lot of accountability in that respect. It's also really important to note that the majority of Granite Staters are opposed to school vouchers. And I think this is especially important going into the 2023 legislative session. Efforts to pass them failed in 2017 and 2018. And there was record turnout to these public hearings when these bills were introduced in 2021. Thousands of people opposed the bills. There was record turnout at the public hearings, signing into that general court website with and submitting that testimony. But ultimately, this bill was passed as part of the statewide budget. And as Michael had said, we want to be really clear that this really is part of a coordinated national effort to undermine public education. We track legislation nationwide. Last year, the year before, there were a number of states who had very similar legislation introduced. And so this really is a coordinated effort. We saw national organizations come into New Hampshire. And so, this is part of a broader effort. And it's something that we'll also keep in mind and keep tracking as we enter that 2023 legislative session. And these national movements, they're not just tied to school vouchers and privatization efforts. They've really had a significant impact on our school climate as well. especially through the passage of the Banned Concepts Law, which is often called the Divisive Concepts Law and things like that, other terms. But that was also folded into the 2021 state budget. The law has chilled speech and teaching in schools. We're hearing that it's creating hostile environments for students and teachers of color in our state. You know, we heard at a recent committee meeting that laws like this, like the Banned Concepts Law, make people ask, you know, make people who live in New Hampshire, who thrive and who raise their families in New Hampshire, it makes them ask themselves, you know, do I belong here? Does the state actually value me as a person? They're passing these kinds of laws. You know, it tells people that they don't belong, and that's really tough. It hurts our students, it hurts our educators, it hurts our communities, it hurts all of us when these kinds of legislation pieces are passed. So that's something that, you know, we engage with quite a bit, and really want to draw a lot of attention to, because it's so critically important. And then shifting gears a little bit again to yet another, and I'm sorry, I'm going through all of these, I'm flying by, but just quickly wrapping up. The last piece that I'll cover tonight is the overhaul of the minimum standards for public school approval. These, you know, if you've been engaged in this at all, we call them the Ed 306s because that's the number that they are in administrative rules. And these are really the foundational administrative regulations for our public schools. The Department of Education is currently actively working on an overhaul that, what we've seen, would strip protections for students and staff. It would gut key program elements and local control, and it would minimize formal instruction in our schools. There is a lot more to cover when it comes to this minimum standards overhaul. We have a lot of resources on this specifically on our website that I'm happy to share. But one of really the most important takeaways is that these rules really appear to move the state closer to the standardization and commodification of student learning. It really opens the door to allowing private organizations to swoop in to break apart pieces of our public schools for profit, whether it's courses, whether it's support staff, whether it's, you know, those wraparound services. It's really breaking apart public education for the commodification of it. This trend in some circles is known as unbundling, which I'll put in air quotes because we've used that language, but we see that in some circles, and it's something that we are keeping a really close eye on. And so in terms of process for the 306s, for the minimum standards, these revisions have been in the works since 2020, but there has been zero input so far for public input. There have been some selective opportunities for some groups and some associations to engage, but no part of it has been public so far. There have been no public meetings, no minutes, no reports. We know that the department has partnered with an association to hold a closed door feedback session that ended today. And it will be really important that we hold the department accountable to being responsive to that feedback from those teachers and educators who were in that room. But again, that was a closed door session. As far as the rest of the process, the formal rulemaking process doesn't actually begin until an initial proposal hits the state board's desk. That could be, we're expecting that to be this winter. It could be as early as their December meeting on the 8th. And then that is, you know, once that hits their desk, then that RSA, the rulemaking RSA, will come into effect. Statutory requirements for a public hearing will begin. But really until then, it's very much a waiting game. You know, we've requested the latest copy of the minimum standards. You know, we have a copy from July on our website. We've been told that there have been updates. We requested those updates so that we could, you know, we could inform the public and say, hey, this is what's happening. That request was denied. And there's a real shroud of secrecy around what's in these minimum standards. And so, you know, it's really a waiting game until these hit the state board's desk. What's in them, what's going to be proposed. Not many people know at this point. There is a bill proposal that would create a commission to restart the process. We're expecting that to be introduced in January in the 2023 legislative session. But as of right now, that is an LSR. We're waiting for, of course, the legislative session to start up, but that's also in the wings. And so, just to kind of wrap up and tie a bow on this, there was an election, and it was last week. in case you didn't know, of course, everyone here probably does. But the outcome of it, fascinating. We are still waiting on hearing what the state representatives count will be. Our Governor CHRISTINA, was reelected. The Executive Council is a 4 Republican, 1 Democrat split, so that didn't change. Some of the members, of course, did change, but the 4-to-1 ratio did not change. The Executive Council is really important for a number of reasons. Right now, for education, it's especially important because they do approve contracts for how the state spends its ESSER allocations. So the American Rescue Plan Act, the funding that the state got, that COVID pandemic relief, they approved those state level contracts and that state spending. So that's sort of where we've had our eyes on with the Executive Council. State Senate, 14 Republicans, 10 Democrats, different people, but same split. And then the state representatives, super interesting. There are 200 Republicans, 199 Democrats elected, 1 tie that was announced just a couple of hours ago in Rochester, and there are still a number of recounts. So that number, razor thin margins, could change really at any time, but this will have huge implications. Already it is having huge implications, but it will have really big implications for what's proposed in 2023, and then how all of those pieces of proposed legislation shake out. Just wrapping up, education was a top issue for New Hampshire residents going to the voting booths. There were a number of really important issues to them. Education was consistently one of the top 5. So school vouchers, school funding, Granite Staters are really interested in these topics. They recognize the problem with school vouchers. They recognize the inequitable school funding system. And so going in, we're coming off of a session in 2021 and 2022 where lawmakers really radically reshaped public education through school vouchers, through that banned concepts law, and really by proposing things like locally funded school vouchers that would be funded directly from school district budgets, through budget tax caps, a teacher loyalty pledge. All of these pieces made education really at the forefront of people's minds. And so, going into 2023, I think there will be a lot of engagement in these issues. As far as what we're expecting in 2023, it is a budget year, so that is going to take up a lot of air in the room in the next couple of months, as the state works toward the budget. Especially interesting given the really slim margins. Who will be in control, and who's going to chair committees and all of that jazz. But it is a budget year, so we will be working very closely on that. There is an LSR around those district-funded school vouchers, those locally funded school vouchers that are funded directly from school district budgets. School funding, a perennial issue. The lawsuits. I think oral arguments for one of them is in January, and then also we're expecting some legislation. There's already legislation submitted around a parental bill of rights, expansion of statewide school vouchers. The governor said on the campaign trail that he would support expanding eligibility for school vouchers. There's already a couple of bills in the works regarding that. Teacher loyalty, that teacher loyalty bill, that sponsor said that she would bring it back in 2023. So, I haven't seen an LSR yet, but it is something that we're keeping an eye on. Same with school budget caps. So a lot of issues. Right now, there's about 25 bills on the LSR list that we are tracking. But, it gets as high as 130, 140 that we track every year. So the closing date for those is November 22nd. And so, within the next couple of weeks, it'll be a sprint to figure out, hey, what's on the docket what are we going to be looking at and that kind of thing. So with that, as far as reaching higher goes, I would invite you to sign up for our email list. We send out newsletters monthly, and then for our New Hampshire Education Network, where we send out regular updates on key pieces that are important and that kind of thing. Ed Funding News is that's the URL for the monthly newsletter, and then the NH Ed Network one is for the Education Network. So with that, I'm sorry I went so quickly. Feel free to shoot me an email if you want to talk, if you have any questions. But with that, I will hand it over to Janet.
Well, first of all, sincere thanks to both Michael and Christina. They covered so much information, so much critical information. So thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and all your work with us. And we encourage everyone who's joined us this evening to turn the information you have received tonight into action. How can you do that? Check the League of Women Voters New Hampshire website at lwvnh.org to learn about upcoming legislation and consider giving testimony either online or at legislative committee meetings. Share your knowledge and views with your own state representatives and senators who pay attention to their constituents. Share critical information regarding public schools through social media posts, letters to the editor, and op-eds. And if you need help crafting these, just send an email to the League website for assistance. Attend your local public school board meetings, either in person or via a live stream link if available. Filing for local school boards usually occurs in January. Then most towns vote in March. Readers pay attention to their neighbors, so just before town meeting is a great time to submit letters to the editor and op-eds supporting public schools. And a video of this event will be sent to you so that you can share it with friends and colleagues. Thank you very much for joining us. Thanks again to Michael and Christina for their excellent presentations. And have a good evening. Good night.